So, as we begin this Portuguese Immigrant Week commemoration, and as we continue with another session, a morning session, as we have had the last few days, and we'll continue until March 11th, more of a lecture of about one aspect or another of the Portuguese American experience in California. We want to thank our partners, I said, FLAD, Luso-American Development Foundation. We'd like to thank, of course, the California Portuguese American Coalition, the Portuguese Fraternal Society of America, and, of course, the Luso-American Education Foundation as well. On behalf of PBBI, that's the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from California State University, Fresno, happy Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. 4th through the 11th of March of this year of 2023. And we're going to begin with a PowerPoint presentation, a little bit of a few slides so we can keep you kind of entertained as I may bore you with some details about the Portuguese presence in California. So hopefully everyone is able to see. The focus today will be the Portuguese media in California, which has such a traditional and very important role in our community. I've said many times before, and it is based not just on anecdotal, it is based actually on some studies that have been done, and it is based on factual information gathered through the community. If we still have a good number, not the number that we would like, but a good number of those in the Portuguese American community that can still communicate in Portuguese. And when I mean communicate, may not be totally fluent sometimes, and especially because I came over at the age of 10 and I write a weekly op-ed, as many of you know, for the Portuguese press in the Azores and Portuguese American press that I collaborate with, and many of the other things I do, translations, etc. And sometimes I don't think I'm as fluent as I should be in the Portuguese language. So fluency has, of course, different parameters for different people sometimes, but if folks can communicate in the Portuguese language, that is, of course, awesome, and that's what we're all looking for, is folks who can communicate in the Portuguese language. And so as we look at this, and as we look at the Portuguese media in California, what I was going to say and would like to share with you is that if by any chance people still speak Portuguese even after the immigrants and the first generation. And what I mean by that is immigrants and first generation, basically because there is, of course, those who immigrated at various ages. I immigrated at the age of 10, and there are folks that immigrated at around the same time in 1968 that came also at a young age. I came, as I said, at the age of 10. There are folks that I know that came at the age of 4 and 5 and 3 and 2 and 1, and they no longer communicate in Portuguese. The majority do, fortunately. And so if folks who are immigrants still communicate in Portuguese, that is awesome, of course. But if the first and second generation, especially the children and grandchildren of immigrants, still communicate in Portuguese, basically, one of the reasons that happens is indeed because of the Portuguese media and its role in the community, whether it was newspapers years and years ago, and people would sit around and read them, and their children and their grandchildren would hear that, or the Portuguese radio, which is, as we know, 100 years old and has done a wonderful job in keeping up the Portuguese radio throughout, of course, the state of California. So I've said this many times, and I know some of you are tired of hearing it, but indeed, if it wasn't for the Portuguese radio and grandparents, I don't know how many people, of course, would be still speaking Portuguese in California. Indeed, according to the statistics, there are 350,000 people in California who identify as being of Portuguese ancestry. And according to the same numbers as well, of these 350,000, about 35,000 or so about 10%, still consider themselves fluent and speak the language, can communicate in the language, which means that about close to 90% of those who are of Portuguese background, it was their grandparents or their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who immigrated, and they don't speak the language. But the Portuguese media in California had a tremendous role, and still does to some degree, in the Portuguese American community. So I'm going to be talking about the Portuguese media in California today on this lecture about the Portuguese presence. And of course, I'll be talking about different aspects of the media. And those different aspects of the media will include the different media that we have had, which is, of course, newspapers, radio, and television, and of course now social media outlets as well. I won't talk much about those because we are just in the initial phase of those, although they've been around for a few years, but it is still an initial phase. So, and I'll be reading parts and bits and pieces from Portuguese language media, chapter 13 of the Portuguese presence in California, written by Dr. Eduardo Meion Dias. So indeed, an immigrant community that mainly turns its back on the English spoken and written word, clinging tenaciously to the sentimental baggage dragged along from its native land. That was originally our community. Of course, that's changed much and much and much. Indeed, the Portuguese press, the Portuguese media, the newspapers, the radio, and later on television was a way for people to not only have contact within the community, but also from the community with Portugal itself. And if we look and at the different Portuguese outlets, if our very first, of course, media was the Portuguese newspaper, and a little bit about the Portuguese newspapers, as you can see there, a Voz Portuguesa. And so, according to, and I'll read from Dr. Eduardo Meion Dias, the Portuguese presence in California, the chapter dedicated to the media, as he says that some controversy exists as to the chronology of the launching of California's first Portuguese newspaper. The way may have been paved in 1880 with the Voz Portuguesa that you can see there, Portuguese Voice, published by Antonio Maria Vicente, a native of the island of Flores, or more likely by the Brazilian Manuel Stone. And as you can see there in the picture, on the left-hand side of a Voz Portuguesa, the editor there at that particular time was indeed Manuel Stone. Several other newspapers subsequently appeared over the years, and many of them, with different affiliations. One Catholic and traditionalist, the other Republican and independent-minded. At times, there were, of course, different violent attacks, sometimes between each other, and also different ways of publishing and different ways of putting forth an editorial line. For example, a Catholic newspaper was denounced for publishing all sorts of absurd claims in their attacks against the Portuguese Republican Party. And when I mean the Portuguese Republican Party, it is not the U.S. Republican Party. So we're talking about at that time, as if you may remember, in the late 1880s and 1890s, and the beginning of Portugal and the beginning of the 20th century, Portugal was still a monarchy. But the Republican forces, those who wanted a republic form of government, which is what we have in Portugal and have had, with an exception of a dictatorship during 50 years, but that's what we've had since 1910. Those voices were very vocal in Portugal, obviously, but they were very vocal outside of Portugal as well, especially those who had come to the United States and other parts of a countries that were a republic form of government, a democratic form of government, of course. And so between 1900 and 1936, 15 newspapers appeared in California's San Francisco Bay Area and the Sacramento and the San Joaquin Valley regions, with some 10 being published simultaneously during the 1920s. Can you just imagine that? In the 1920s, at one time or another, not throughout the entire decade, but at one time we had around 10 Portuguese newspapers. But throughout the whole decade, we had 4 or 5 just about every single time. And so quite a bit of interesting about that is that a lot of the folks that had immigrated did not know how to read or write, but there were some that did, and they found a way to have these newspapers published, and even some with ephemeral lives, but they were very limited publications, but they were able to survive 3 years, 5 years, 4 years, some, of course, as we know, longer than that. And one little bit of information here before I go on to the next slide about the Voz Portuguesa, founded, as I said, in 1980. And so if you look right here, and I'll put my mouse over it so you can see, it says when it talks about what kind of newspaper it is, of course, it has right up there, you can see the crown. So, at this time, it was the Kingdom of Portugal. And it says Periódico da Colônia Portuguesa. At that time, we didn't call Portuguese communities or Portuguese diaspora. It was a diaspora in a sense, in a lot of sense, but since the beginning, but it hadn't been, it wasn't very active. It had just began the immigration process. And so at that time, and even when I came over in the 1960s, I still heard people talk about the Portuguese colony in Tulare, the Portuguese colony in Oakland, the Portuguese colony in San Diego. And so why the word colony? In part because Portugal had these colônias portuguesas, these overseas colonies in Africa, in Asia, and up until Brazil, of course, was independent in South America. So it was talking about the Portuguese presence in California as a colony of Portugal, Periódico de Colônia Portuguesa. And then if you look over to the right side, it says Político, Literário e Mercantil. And so describing what the newspaper is going to be all about. Político, Literário e Mercantil. Político, I think everyone can figure that one out if you don't speak Portuguese. Political, so they took some stands without any problem. They always had an opinion, and a very strong one. Literário, literary. And indeed, the Portuguese newspapers, especially of 100 and plus years ago, had a very important role, which sort of is the same way as it has had in the Azores and in other parts of Portugal as well. A literary aspect in mainland Portugal as well, and in Madeira, which was newspapers used to publish lots of literary pages. They used to publish poetry on a regular basis. They used to publish literary reviews on a regular basis. These early newspapers used to publish little bits and pieces of a novel, so some or a short story. And they would take a page every week and have a segment of that short story that people would continue reading on a weekly basis. So there was a very, very strong literary component to these newspapers in the traditional sense, not just a literary article, but or an article about everyday life that has some literary value to it, other than journalistic. I'm talking about the publishing of poetry, publishing of excerpts from novels, from short stories, and essays as well. And mercantil, which of course, mercantile, so mercantil, commercial, they had to make a living, they had to sell ads, there were ads in all of the newspapers, and that's how they paid the bills. Another one of the newspapers, which you can see here, one of our early newspapers, and this one, as you can see, was from the 16th of July of 1885. And it is o Progresso Californiense, or the Californian Progress. Semanal, again, and this one a bit different. Semanal, literário, noticioso e mercantil. And here at the bottom, órgão da colônia portuguesa dos Estados Unidos. So this one was a little bit more ambitious. Instead of saying just órgão or a newspaper for the Portuguese in California, it said it were a newspaper for the Portuguese colony in the United States. And it was published in San Francisco, as you can see there. This is the edition from a Thursday, the 16th of July of 1885. And on it, again, describing the newspaper, semanal literário, noticioso e mercantil. Literary, as I explained, noticioso, lots of news. So a news outlet, as we would call it today, and mercantil, again, the commercial part of it as well. And then a little bit about O Lavrador Português, because it was one of the few newspapers that was published in the southern part of the valley. And so the Lavrador Português eventually went up to the Bay Area. But this edition right here, as you can see, in 1913, it was published in Hanford. It was actually published in Hanford. It was published in Tulare, and then it was published in Northern California. and mostly because the publisher Artur Ávila, and this one here, Artur Ávila and Constantino de Barcelos, but Artur Ávila was one of our pioneers of Portuguese radio as well. And so, and he lived in this area for a while, and then he moved up north. And you have their Política Americana. This is kind of interesting. So Wilson promete iniciar uma nova era de paz. So an editorial on Wilson as our president of the United States. And so on it went into American politics, not just the Portuguese politics from Portugal, but American politics. And then off there to the right, you see a Colônia Portuguesa, the Portuguese colony, and talks about news and information about the Portuguese colony. And then the lady that you see there, the photograph, Dona Maria Adelaide Encarnação, a president of the SPRSI. And so that is wonderful to see women being featured. A lot of times they weren't. We're talking about 1913 in the front page of these newspapers. O Lavrador Português, it was a weekly newspaper, this edition out of Hanford, California. And the newspaper, as I said, was published weekly. And that little quote on top, Lavrador means farmer, so it's the Portuguese farmer, if we translate it literally. And the quote on top, honesty is the aim of the Portuguese colony, which is quite an interesting claim that they had on the newspaper. So another one of the newspapers, O Lavrador Português. Another one here, just to spend not much time on it, but it's a Liberdade, the liberty. And this one is a bit later on in 1934. Published in Alameda in Oakland, and talked a lot about the community. So it talked a lot about the community. You can see here, Viva o Conselho Supremo, again, SPRSI, a bit of a history of the SPRSI, a reorganization with some Portuguese folks involved in a funeral home in that area. Talking here about Festa do Espírito Santo à beira-mar in 1934. It's a news article about the Portuguese Festa in Caiucas. They're in the Central Coast. And right on top, Palestras Femininas. And I think this, and it's a wonderful piece. I had the opportunity to read it. Palestras Femininas was basically a talks on feminine talks. So women talking about women's issues. And this is very interesting, considering that this is published in, of course, 1934. And that's a bit of the newspaper history. Of course, as you know, today, before I go there, today we only have one newspaper, and it is published every other week, twice a month, on the 1st and the 15th, and it is the Portuguese Tribune, or Tribuna Portuguesa, which we'll talk about at the end. But we had lots of newspapers. Jornal Português was one of the longest ones. And I'll quote here from Dr. Eduardo Meian Dias, in 1940s and 50s, journalistic fever cooled, and just the Jornal Português, long under the direction of Alberto Lemos, survived, the most enduring of the Luso-Californian periodicals, published from 1932 until 1997. So basically, this newspaper that lasted basically 65 years is to date the longest running newspaper. Of course, the Voz de Portugal also was founded in 1960, and the Voice of Portugal in Hayward, and continued also for quite a few years as well. But Jornal Português for those 65 years is the longest running newspaper under that name. And of course, the Portuguese Tribune now is over 40 years old, and I'm sure it will be, it will reach that milestone of 65 years of publication. The Portuguese Tribune, which as I said, we'll talk about at the end. There were others in the 1970s and 80s after the Portuguese Tribune, actually in 1979. We have Notícia, that was in 1984, Portugal USA, and myself and my good friends Pedro Valadão Costa, and later with Fernando Valadão, and also Nazário Borba, we published a monthly newspaper here in Tulare called Novidade, and that's began in 1983, I should say, and it went on until 1989. So it was a 6-year adventure. It was monthly, and it was free of charge. We used to put it in all the supermarkets, Portuguese businesses, etc. We had like 5 or 6 different outlets, if I'm not mistaken, in Tulare. We had a couple in Visalia, and we had again 4 or 5, thanks to my good friend Nazario Borba, in Hanford and Lemoore. We used to put in the churches as well with the Portuguese Mass. And so we published, I believe at that time, we were publishing 1,500, and that's a pretty good amount of newspapers. And we had some special issues that we published 3,000 and 4,000. And they all would go, and they basically covering news and information about the Portuguese community here throughout, of course, the Valley. There was also the Luso-Americano, which is one of our longest running newspapers now in the United States, that had a California edition for a while, and also the Portuguese American Chronicle that appeared in 1997 and also had published for a few years as well. So lots of different we could do a whole event of about hours and hours to talk to you about the Portuguese press in California. Radio. Radio, of course, is our most popular known media outlet in the history of the Portuguese in California, because while we had many newspapers, as I've just mentioned, we've had probably quadrupled that, at least in radio programs. When I started my radio program in 1976 here in Tulare, or actually in Hanford, KOAD was the name of the station, on a Saturday morning, 1 hour a day. When I started the radio program, we had over a dozen radio programs just in Tulare and Kings County, And so at that time, this was the late 70s, there were like over 40 radio programs throughout the entire state of California. So broadcast media has been very, very important. According to Dr. Eduardo Meillon Dias, on June 10th of 1920, and this had to be an experimental type of radio station because radio wasn't even officialized here, but there were those unofficial radio stations, sort of pirate radios, they used to call them, that were experiencing with radio broadcasts. And so in 1920, according to the research and published here in this book by Dr. Eduardo Meillon Dias, a gentleman by the name of José Vitorino, who, from what we know, was illiterate, did not know how to read or write, but that was many of the community, of course, at that time. In 1920, in Stockton, began a Portuguese radio program called Program Vasco da Gama, and the program was in, as I said, in Stockton, in one of these radio stations that was just beginning, that was not even officialized, and it was called Vasco da Gama and started on June 10th of 1920. So basically, just about 123 years ago. But that was kind of an experiment, according to the research by Dr. Eduardo Meillon Dias, that didn't last too long. And so from what we know, basically just a few months, because then the radio station had to be officialized, and there were lots of things going on as far as these so-called pirate radios. But in 1930, and there is some evidence that was written recently by Professor Peña Rodriguez, that in 1930, there was a Portuguese radio program in San Diego. And that Portuguese radio program in San Diego started in 1930. It was an hour a week on Tuesdays. Also, the research that was done is it didn't last a very long period of time, but it did exist. And then, of course, Artur Ávila in the 1930s also began his very, very famous Portuguese radio show, and the Portuguese radio show of Artur V. Ávila and his wife Celeste Ávila, known as Rosinha. The program had a name of Castelos Românticos, or the Romantic Castles, and that was obviously one of the most popular Portuguese radio programs. And then from there, many, many others. For example, in the Valley here in the 1930s, and there were Portuguese radio programs all throughout the Valley. And so Portuguese radio became kind of a staple in the Portuguese community. And I have a picture there of Mr. Joaquim Morrison. It could be of any other person, but Joaquim Morrison was a very important radio figure, and not just radio, an important personality and a pillar in many aspects, not just of radio, but of services and of community service. Joaquim Morrison from the city of Hanford. but there were pillars in Northern California, there were pillars in the Central Valley, there were pillars in the Sacramento area, in Southern California as well. Portuguese radio really did shape our community for many generations, and indeed, we have to write the history of the Portuguese radio in California. It's spread out through different things and different publications. And besides writing that history, we also have to pay homage to these people, because if we are the community that we are, we owe a lot to these pioneers, such as Mr. Morrison and many others, such as the Avilas, and such as the Santoses in Tulare, and those in Southern and Northern California. And so today, what do we have in radio? Well, we have an amalgam. So, of course, KLBS in KLBS in Hanford. We used to have KIGS, and that is no longer in existence, hasn't been for over a decade. But KLBS 1330 AM is still a full-time Portuguese radio station. It is the only full-time Portuguese radio station on the year AM in the west coast of the United States. And then, of course, KSQQ in the Bay Area, in the San Jose area, also broadcasts a couple of hours a day in Portuguese. And then we have the online radios, which are very, very popular. And today, my students tell me that's how they listen to radio, and that's how they've been listening to radio for 10 years. And so they're in their 20s, and they probably never seen a radio, it seems like. So we have the Aspra Media Group, João Manuel Dias, and the entire group, Rádio Portugal USA, Rádio Lusalândia, all of the different outlets that are part of the Diaspora Media Group. And we have Palma Radio, and Nelson Leite and his team as well. So there are these outlets that allow people to have different programs, podcasts, and all kinds of services that are indeed looking at the community today. A little bit about Portuguese language television. It doesn't have, of course, the history, the rather long history that the newspapers have since 1880, or that the Portuguese radio has since 1920, but television also came at a much later time. And so let's look a little bit about Portuguese television. If you look there to the right, Casey Santos, and it's a newspaper, thanks to Tulare Memories article, and it talks about a tribute that was paid to Casey Santos in 1957. In 1957, it's a long time ago, my friends. I'm 64 years old, and I wasn't born in 1967. So 57. 1957, Casey Santos, who I've met and knew quite well, we were colleagues in radio for many years. Casey had a television show here in the Tulare area, in the Tulare Visalia area. That was the first Portuguese television show that we know in the west coast of the United States, and who knows, maybe in the whole U.S., but for sure in the west coast of the United States, 1957. Casey had other shows. So Casey did not just have this show in 1957 that lasted a while, a couple of years, but then he also came back with another show in 1965, and he actually came back again with another show later on. And so Casey was a pioneer in many, many, many different things, especially, of course, Casey was a pioneer in radio also, and of course, as I said, in television. He had a Portuguese radio, daily Portuguese radio show called Hora de Recreio for over 40 years as well. And on television, Casey, of course, had, as I said, these different experiments with television, and he was actually the very first Portuguese television broadcaster. So his program was called Hora de Recreio on radio. He also turned that into a television show as well, as I said, in 1957, then in 1965, and that one lasted until 1967. And then he revived the television again in 1972. So the one between 65 and 67 was a half-hour a week. And then in 1972, with the Channel 26 in Visalia, originally in Visalia, he started a television show, and that was an hour a week in 1972, and that lasted for almost 4 years. And then there were other Portuguese television pioneers. In 1985, as you can see right there, there's a story about the radio from the 1960s, but he was also a pioneer in television, and that is Mr. Carlos Goulart, who did a television program for many, many years, and he began his television career after a very successful radio career in the 1980s. And also in the late 60s and 70s, early 70s, a very, very, right there, very, not a good picture, but a Joaquim Esteves, who is a radio icon still today, a radio pioneer, and who also went into Portuguese television station out of the Modesto area, also in the 1960s and early 70s. And then we have, as you can see right here, Tito Rebelo and his wife, and Laura Rebelo. And Tito was one of our icons, still is one of our icons of Portuguese radio, one of the tremendous voices that revolutionized radio when KRVE originally was put on the air. And a radio station in San Jose that came and brought all of the Portuguese broadcasters together and had actually these professional newscasters and radio personalities such as Tito Rebelo, José João Encarnação, and many others. And Laura Rebelo had for quite a few years out of the Valley Modesto area as well, a program called Televalde. And it was also a Portuguese television program. In 1987, Channel 49 in Fresno began Portuguese radio broadcasting. 2 years after, not quite 2 years, about a year and a half after we started broadcasting just the mass in Portuguese, we started a program called Os Portugueses no Vale with myself and João Souza and Padre Raul Marta, Father Marta, and then a few years later with Lucia Noia, just Lucia and myself. I would moderate every other week, and she would do the other weeks as well. And it was called Os Portugueses no Vale. It started in 1989, and it ended in 2019. And then, of course, still existing is RTA, Radio Televisão Artesia, which is a unique project on cable, and now, of course, through all the social media outlets as well, out of the Artesia area, and has been around for quite a few decades as well. One of the pioneers, Osvaldo Palhinha, Manuel Aguiar, still involved with it, and many other folks that contribute on a voluntary basis to the programming of RTA, the Portuguese television service out of the Artesia area. And as we come to the end of this presentation, very brief, not doing justice to the role of the Portuguese press in California, the Portuguese media, but to talk a little bit about what we have. Of course, we have the Portuguese Tribune, Tribuna Portuguesa, and it is a newspaper that is published out of Modesto, originally out of San Jose, started by João Brum in 1979. And today, the Tribuna Portuguesa is published twice a month, on the 1st and the 15th of every single month. Also, we had for a couple of years, unfortunately just ended a few months ago, the Portuguese American Hour, which was a unique, different program. It was an hour a day, Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m., multicultural 1600 a.m., KGST, a radio station out of Fresno, and it was in English, but totally dedicated to the Portuguese American community. I feel this is the way that we need to go in many things within the community, but that is not for this program. This is just to give you a bit of a historical overview. And of course, on top, you see there, Mr. Batista Vieira and his lovely wife. And there is a man that has invested heavily in Portuguese radio, whether it be in the Bay Area, whether it be in the San Joaquin Valley, and in many aspects, if we still have radio on any AM or FM station, and all aspects actually right now, we owe it to the tenacity and of Senor Batista Vieira, of Mr. Batista Vieira and his family, who have committed and still are committed to keeping a few hours in the San Jose area daily, and also a full-time Portuguese radio station in Los Banos, KLBS. Again, the Batista Vieira, Mr. Batista Vieira was an original partner, three of them, Rosa Vieira and Esteves when the KRVE was founded, and then eventually there was a separation. Of course, Mr. Esteves disappeared, and then Mr. Halza went on to other radio ventures as well and did quite well, and had also Portuguese radio programs as well on his radio stations. And then Mr. Batista Vieira continued and came into the San Joaquin Valley at KLBS. That still does a vital service to the Portuguese American community, to the Portuguese American experience. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll be back tomorrow. We'll be back on Tuesday, I should say, and Wednesday as well. But Tuesday at 8 o'clock in the morning, Portuguese Immigrant Week in California continues. It is a service of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, that's PBBI from Fresno State. It has the cooperation of FLAD, Luso-American Development Foundation, the California Portuguese American Coalition, the Luso-American Education Foundation, and the Portuguese Fraternal Society of America. And tomorrow we'll be talking about Portuguese literary expression in California. And this evening we have a presentation as well at 5 o'clock. We'll be putting that up through social media outlets also. So thank you for joining the Portuguese Media, a very brief less than 40-minute presentation, something in Portuguese media that we could do for hours and hours. And it is something that we at PBBI at Fresno State are committed to continuing to archive, to research, and we would love to do a publication with it as well, because it has played a very important role, whether it be newspapers, radio, or television. It has, and it continues to play a role, a different role. And again, we would need to reflect upon that as well, but this is not the opportunity to do so. This is not the time to do so. We just wanted to give you more of a news, of a historical aspect of the Portuguese media in California, and talk to you about different aspects, very, very likely, because these things have to be researched, of course, and much research has been done as well. And so thank you all for joining us. We hope to continue to see you every single weekday until the 11th, when we end with just a wrap up. But we have 2 sessions per day, all Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. We're committed at PBBI Fresno State to this. And as I was saying, we're committed to the media studies as well. And that's why we at PBBI Fresno State are coordinating the Azores Diaspora Media Alliance, ADMA, because it's a way to bring all of the media together on both sides of the Atlantic to serve the Portuguese, the Azorean diaspora as well, and to serve the archipelago also, and to reach out, of course, to mainland Portugal and Madeira archipelago as well. Portuguese literary expressions in California will be our topic for tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno. Happy Immigrant Week. Happy Portuguese Immigrant Week to everyone. And whether you are an immigrant or not, let us celebrate, in this case, the Portuguese immigrant experience. And also, by celebrating the Portuguese immigrant experience, we're celebrating the entire experience of all immigrants from all walks of life. Thank you so much. Take care.